My hand hovered over the brass knocker of my parents' Brooklyn brownstone. I was 35 years old, running a successful crisis PR firm, yet standing on that porch always made my stomach tighten. I had come to drop off the deposit check for their 40th anniversary gala, an extravagant event I was as usual expected to fund. But before I could knock, my mother Yvonne's voice drifted through the screen door, sharp and dismissive. 50,000 is nothing, Jamal, she was saying. Her tone held that soothing, almost reverent quality she reserved exclusively for my older brother. I'll just have Kendra write a check from that PR business of hers. She doesn't have kids. What else is she spending it on? I froze. $50,000. Not a loan, not a request. An expectation. I listened as Jamal, the golden boy who had failed out of 3 business ventures in 5 years, let out a relieved sigh. You're right, Mom. Kendra never refuses family. Besides, it's for a good cause. Crypto is down right now, but it's bound to bounce back. Crypto. He had gambled 50 grand on crypto, and my mother was volunteering my savings to cover his losses. The sheer audacity of it left me breathless. This wasn't just entitlement, it was a fundamental lack of respect for everything I had built. I didn't burst through the door, I didn't scream or demand an explanation. After a lifetime of being managed, manipulated, and guilt-tripped, the anger I felt wasn't explosive. It was cold, precise, and absolute. I turned on my heel, walked quietly down the steps, and slid into the passenger seat of my car. My husband Trayvon took one look at my face and knew exactly what had happened. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer a shoulder to cry on. He simply reached into his briefcase, pulled out his iPad, and handed it to me. Transfer it, he said, his voice steady and calm. Now, every single penny. I opened my banking app, staring at the joint family account. The account my mother had insisted I keep open years ago, claiming it was necessary for managing the family's church donations and keeping up our image. It had always been a thinly veiled mechanism for her to monitor my finances and guilt me into paying for Jamal's endless string of mistakes. Are you sure? I asked, my thumb hovering over the screen. If I do this, it's war. Trevin started the car, his jaw set. It's already war, Kendra. They've been treating you like an ATM for a decade. Every time Jamal messes up, you pay. Every time your mother wants to impress the congregation, you pay. It ends today. Hit confirm. As we drove away from the brownstone, the reality of what I was doing settled in. I remembered the time I had to delay buying my first home because Jamal needed bail money after a DUI, an incident my mother had framed as a minor misunderstanding. I remembered paying for my parents' luxury vacation to the Bahamas while I was working 80-hour weeks to get my PR firm off the ground. Always the expectation, never the gratitude. Always the demand, never the respect. I looked at the balance on the screen. Over $75,000. Money I had earned, money. I had saved money they felt entitled to simply because I was family and I was successful. I hit confirm. The screen flashed, processing the transaction. The joint account was now empty. Every dime transferred to a secure private account in my name only. The safety net they had relied on was gone, and I felt a profound, terrifying sense of liberation. The rules of engagement had changed, and they had no idea what was coming. I was standing on the porch of my childhood home, my knuckles raised to strike the heavy oak door, when I heard the promise that shattered 35 years of blind loyalty. The summer heat was thick, pressing down on my shoulders, but the words drifting through the screen door made my blood run absolutely cold. My mother Yvonne was using that soft, reverent tone she reserved exclusively for her golden child. 50,000 is nothing, Jamal. She cooed, the ice clinking in her glass. Do not stress yourself into an early grave. I will just have your sister write a check from that PR business of hers. She does not have kids yet. What else is she spending her money on? I froze. My hand dropped to my side. $50,000. It was not a question. It was an expectation. I listened as Jamal, a man who had failed out of 3 different business ventures in the last 5 years, let out a loud, relieved sigh. You are right, Mama, he said. Kendra never refuses family. Besides, it is for a good cause. My crypto portfolio is down right now, but it is bound to bounce back by the holidays. I did not push the door open. I did not scream. I did not demand an explanation. After a lifetime of being managed and guilt-tripped, the anger I felt was not explosive. It was precise. I turned on my heel, walked quietly down the brick steps, and slid into the passenger seat of my car. My husband Trayvon took one look at my face and locked his phone. He did not offer a shoulder to cry on or ask what was wrong. He simply reached into the back seat, grabbed his leather briefcase, and pulled out his iPad. "Transfer it," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Now, every single penny." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking application. The screen illuminated the joint family account. My mother had insisted I keep her name on it years ago, claiming it was strictly necessary for managing our family tithes and keeping up our image at the megachurch. It had always been a trap, a way for her to monitor my finances and guilt me into paying for my brother's endless string of mistakes. "Are you absolutely sure?" I asked, my thumb hovering over the transfer button. "If I do this, it means war." Trayvon started the engine. "It is already war, Kendra. They have been treating you like a personal ATM for a decade. Jamal wrecks his car, you pay the deductible. Jamal launches a doomed food truck business, you buy the equipment. Your mother wants to impress the congregation with a new sanctuary wing donation, you write the check. It ends today. Hit confirm." The reality of his words settled into my bones. I thought about the time I had to delay buying my first home because Jamal needed bail money after an incident my mother framed as a minor misunderstanding. I thought about paying for my parents' luxury cruise to the Bahamas while I was working 80-hour weeks to keep my crisis PR firm afloat. I stared at the balance on the screen. It was over $75,000. Money I had earned through sleepless nights managing corporate scandals and relentless media cycles. Money they felt entitled to simply because we shared a bloodline. I pressed confirm. The screen flashed green. The joint account dropped to zero. Every dime was now sitting in a secure private account in my name only. The safety net they had relied on was gone. It was 2 a.m. The house was entirely silent except for the hum of the central air conditioning and the sharp rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. Trayvon and I sat at the marble kitchen island bathed in the harsh blue light of our laptops. A mug of black coffee sat untouched beside my hand. I was not just moving money anymore. I was tearing down the entire financial infrastructure my mother had woven around my life. Trayvon scrolled through a dense PDF of corporate paperwork, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Look at this," he said, turning his screen toward me. "She really had you sign this operating agreement when you were 23 years old. You practically gave her executive override on your own company." I leaned in, reading the legal jargon I had naively initialed a dozen years ago. Back then, my firm was just an idea, a startup I ran out of a cramped studio apartment. Yvonne had convinced me that having an older, established co-signer would make me look more credible to corporate clients. It was a lie. It was a leash. She had weaponized my youth and ambition to bind herself to my future success. Over the years, she had used that leverage to casually review my ledgers, silently judging my expenditures while simultaneously calculating exactly how much she could siphon off for Jamal. I pulled up the state registry portal and began drafting the new articles of incorporation. I typed with furious precision, formally restructuring the LLC to completely sever Yvonne from any legal or financial association with my business. I stripped her access to the merchant accounts, revoked her authorization on the corporate credit lines, and wiped her name from the vendor contracts. The process was tedious, requiring me to verify identity protocols and upload notarized declarations, but every keystroke felt like shedding a physical weight. "We are burning the bridge," Trayvon said, watching me upload the finalized documents to the State Business Bureau. I hit submit on the portal. "Let her try to open the vault now," I said. Exactly 1 week later, the doorbell chimed. I was standing in my kitchen reviewing a press release for a high-profile client when Yvonne barged through the front door. She did not wait for an invitation. She never did. She marched straight into my home, holding 2 large Tupperware containers of Sunday leftovers, wielding them like a Trojan horse. She was dressed impeccably in her usual church attire, a tailored cream suit with matching pearls projecting the flawless image she guarded so fiercely. Trevin looked up from his newspaper at the dining table, his expression hardening instantly. I set my phone down. Yvonne slammed the plastic containers onto the kitchen island, immediately shattering the quiet Sunday morning atmosphere. "I brought you some roast and yams," she announced, her voice overly loud, dripping with a fake sweetness that always preceded a demand. Before I could even say thank you, she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. She slid it across the smooth marble counter directly into my hands. It was a past due notice from a high-risk lending agency. The balance, highlighted in bold red ink, was $50,000. "Your brother has found himself in a slight bind," Yvonne said, smoothing her skirt. "The market has been incredibly unfair to him lately. I need you to write a check to this agency by tomorrow morning. They are threatening to seize his assets." I picked up the notice, looked at the astronomical interest rate, and calmly slid the paper right back across the marble. "I am fresh out of charity, Mom," I said. The fake sweetness vanished from Yvonne's face instantly. Her jaw tightened and her eyes narrowed into dark slits. "Excuse me," she snapped. "I said I am not paying Jamal's gambling debts. He is a grown man. He can face his own consequences." Yvonne planted both hands on the island, leaning over the granite. "You listen to me, little girl," she hissed. "You do not turn your back on your blood. Jamal is trying to build a legacy for his family. You have more money than you know what to do with, and you are going to help your brother." I crossed my arms. "No, I am not." Yvonne snatched the paper off the counter, her chest heaving with indignation. "You think you are so smart, Kendra," she said, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "You think because you run a fancy PR firm you can disrespect your mother. Let us see how smart you feel tomorrow morning. I am going down to the bank the minute they open. I am freezing the joint accounts, and I am locking the business credit lines. Let us see how your little agency runs when you cannot make payroll on Friday." She turned and stormed out of the kitchen, her heels striking the hardwood floor like hammer blows. She slammed the heavy front door so hard the framed pictures on the wall rattled. Trayvon folded his newspaper slowly and looked at me across the room. I picked up my coffee mug, took a slow sip, and smiled. She had absolutely no idea that she was threatening to lock a vault that I had already emptied and dismantled 48 hours ago. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of frantic energy my public relations firm thrived on. I was in the middle of drafting a damage control statement for a corporate client when my personal cell phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times before swiping to answer, placing the phone on speaker and setting it gently on my glass desk. The sound of Yvonne's screaming echoed through my corner office. She was not whispering or attempting to maintain her pristine public image. She was standing in the lobby of the Chase Bank branch in downtown Brooklyn, and she was absolutely furious. "I demand to know what you did!" she shrieked, her voice bouncing off the marble walls of the bank. "The manager just told me my name is no longer on the corporate charter. He said I am an unauthorized individual and threatened to call security if I did not lower my voice." "What kind of trick are you playing, Kendra?" I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and picked up my pen. "I did exactly what you told me you were going to do, Mom. I managed my business accounts. You tried to freeze my company to punish me for not paying Jamal's gambling debts. I just made sure you never had the power to do that again." I could hear her breathing heavily through the phone, the realization of her public humiliation setting in. She had marched into that bank expecting to wield her maternal authority like a weapon, only to be escorted out like a common nuisance. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from screaming rage to a cold, venomous hiss. "You think you have won because you hid your little money," she said. "You and Trayvon are coming to Sunday dinner after church this weekend. You are going to sit at my table, and we are going to discuss your absolute lack of respect in front of your father and your brother. Do not even think about making an excuse. You will be there." She hung up before I could respond. I picked up my phone, walked out of my office, and found Trayvon in the executive boardroom. I relayed the conversation word for word. He closed his laptop and looked up at me, a sharp, knowing glint in his eye. They want an audience, he said quietly. Let us give them a show. Sunday afternoon felt thick with impending hostility. Trevon and I arrived at my parents' brownstone just as the rest of the family was returning from service. The dining room table was set with Yvonne's finest porcelain china and heavy silver flatware. My father, Calvin, sat at the head of the table, reading his phone, completely detached from the tension radiating through the room. Jamal and his wife, Brittany, sat directly across from Trevon and me. The blatant favoritism began before anyone even picked up a fork. Yvonne emerged from the kitchen carrying a massive silver platter holding a perfectly roasted prime rib. She placed it in the center of the table and began carving. Without saying a word, she expertly sliced the tender, juicy center cuts and placed them delicately onto Jamal's plate. She then served 2 equally perfect slices to Brittany. When it was my turn, Yvonne deliberately carved the dry, charred end pieces of the roast. She dropped the burnt meat onto my plate with a loud clatter of her serving fork. You always liked the crispy pieces best, Yvonne said smoothly, not quite meeting my eyes. I did not touch my fork. I simply sat back and watched the performance unfold. Brittany vigorously stirred her sweet tea, letting the ice cubes clink loudly against the glass to draw attention to herself. She let out a long, theatrical sigh. I am just so incredibly stressed out right now, Kendra Brittany said, her voice dripping with manufactured exhaustion. Jamal and I are practically broke. The bank sent another notice on Friday. We are literally facing foreclosure on our home and it feels like nobody even cares. As she dramatically wiped a fake tear from her cheek, she casually brushed her blonde hair behind her ear. The dining room chandelier light caught the thick, gleaming gold of a Cartier love bracelet secured around her wrist. It was brand new, completely unscratched, and retailed for roughly $12,000. Jamal slammed his fist onto the heavy wooden table, causing the crystal water glasses to rattle dangerously. Enough games, Kendra, he demanded, his voice thick with entitlement. You need to write that $50,000 check right now. Are you honestly going to sit there and let your own nephew and niece end up sleeping on the streets while you sit in your fancy house doing crisis management for strangers? Family comes first. You owe us. My father finally looked up from his screen. He pointed his steak knife in my direction, his brow furrowed in annoyance. Just write the check, Kendra. Keep the peace in this house. Your brother needs you, and you have more than enough to spare. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell, and I certainly did not cry. After a lifetime of shrinking myself to fit into their narrative, I felt nothing but a calm, surgical precision. I unzipped my structured leather tote bag and reached inside. I pulled out a thick stack of 8x10 glossy photographs that my private investigator had delivered to my office on Thursday. I dealt the photographs across the fine linen tablecloth like a casino dealer. The heavy photo paper made a satisfying slapping sound as it hit the wood. The first photograph slid directly in front of my father. It was a high-resolution image of Jamal standing in a Las Vegas 5IP lounge, holding a massive sparkler over a magnum of expensive champagne. The digital timestamp printed in the corner proved the photo was taken exactly 6 days ago. The second photograph slid in front of Yvonne. It was a printed screenshot from a private social media account. It showed Brittany posing in the mirror of a luxury boutique surrounded by 4 massive designer shopping bags. The caption read, "Retail therapy cures all stress." The date on the post was the exact same afternoon they claimed the bank had mailed their foreclosure warning. I am fresh out of charity for liars, I said, my voice cutting through the dead silence of the dining room. You want $50,000 to save your house, Jamal? Try returning the Cartier bracelet on your wife's wrist and refunding the bottle service from your little Vegas getaway. The facade shattered instantly. My father stared at the photograph of Jamal in the club, his jaw tight. Yvonne opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Brittany burst into loud, performative sobs, hiding her face in her hands to cover the embarrassment of being publicly exposed. Jamal's face turned a violent shade of purple. He kicked his heavy dining chair backward, sending it crashing onto the hardwood floor. He lunged across the dining table, his hands reaching blindly toward me. Trevon moved faster than Jamal could even register. He did not brace himself or shout a warning. He simply stepped squarely in front of me, catching Jamal by the shoulder mid-lunge and shoving him forcefully backward. Jamal stumbled his expensive loafers slipping on the rug and crashed back into the wall. "Do not ever take a step toward my wife again," Trayvon said, his voice dangerously low and completely unyielding. I picked up my designer bag and pushed my chair in neatly. "Enjoy the burnt ends, Mom," I said. Trayvon and I walked out the front door, leaving the house in complete echoing chaos. We got into our car and Trayvon started the engine, pulling quickly away from the curb. The victory felt sharp, clean, and deeply satisfying. We had finally drawn the line. But as we merged onto the main avenue heading back toward the city, Trayvon's phone chimed loudly through the car's Bluetooth audio system. He glanced at the dashboard screen and his expression instantly dropped from calm satisfaction to absolute dread. He abruptly pulled the car over to the shoulder of the road, throwing the vehicle into park. "Kendra," he said, his voice suddenly tight with genuine alarm. "Someone just applied for a $100,000 commercial line of credit, and they used your social security number to do it." My phone buzzed against the glass of my office desk at exactly 9 on Tuesday morning. I was in the middle of reviewing a crisis mitigation strategy for a corporate client. Trayvon was sitting across from me reviewing our quarterly projections. The caller identification flashed my mother's name. I let it ring twice before I hit the speaker button and set the phone down. The sound of my mother's screaming bounced off the acoustic panels of my office. She was not using her sweet church voice. She was furious, and I could hear the distinct ambient noise of a busy bank lobby behind her. "I demand to know what kind of fraudulent game you are playing, Kendra." Her voice was shrill, completely abandoning the polished matriarch persona she guarded with her life. "I am standing in the lobby of the Chase branch on Fifth Avenue. Mr. Caldwell just had the audacity to tell me I am an unauthorized individual. He refused to pull up your business ledgers. He refused to freeze your accounts, and he threatened to call the security guard if I did not lower my voice. You humiliated me in front of women I serve on the usher board with." Trayvon did not look up from his spreadsheets. He just took a slow sip of his black coffee, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. I leaned forward and spoke clearly toward the phone microphone. "I did exactly what you told me you were going to do, Mom. I managed my business accounts. You stood in my kitchen and threatened to freeze my company to punish me for not paying Jamal's gambling debts. I just made sure you never had the power to do that again. You cannot freeze a vault you no longer have the keys to." I could hear her sharp intake of breath over the line. The reality of her public humiliation was finally settling in. She had marched into that bank branch expecting to wield her maternal authority like a weapon, fully intending to financially cripple my firm before lunchtime. She expected me to call her begging for access to my own payroll funds. Instead, she was the one being escorted toward the revolving doors like a common nuisance. When she spoke again, her tone shifted from explosive rage to a cold, venomous hiss. "You think you have won because you hid your little money?" she snapped. "You think you can disrespect your own mother and walk away unscathed? You and Trayvon are coming to Sunday dinner this weekend. You are going to sit at my dining room table, and we are going to discuss your absolute lack of loyalty in front of your father and your brother." I picked up a silver pen and began twirling it between my fingers. "I am fairly certain we covered my lack of loyalty when you demanded a $50,000 bailout for a grown man's mistakes. I have nothing left to discuss with Jamal or you." "This is not an invitation, Kendra," she barked, her voice dropping an octave into that commanding tone she used to terrify me as a child. "This is a summons. You will be at the house Sunday at 3 o'clock sharp, right after morning service. You are going to explain to your family why you are letting your brother face financial ruin while you sit in your fancy office playing boss. Do not even think about making an excuse. You will be there." The line went dead with a sharp click. I picked up my phone, turned the screen off, and slid it into my desk drawer. Trayvon finally closed his laptop. He looked at me across the desk, a tight, knowing expression on his face. He knew my mother's tactics better than anyone. Sunday dinner was never just a meal in our family. It was a courtroom, and my mother was the judge, jury, and executioner. "She is not looking for an explanation," Trayvon said quietly, folding his hands on the glass table. "She is looking for an audience. She wants to use your father and Jamal to pressure you into writing that check. She thinks if she corners you in front of the whole family, you will fold just like you always used to." I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. For 10 years, I had dreaded those Sunday dinners. I had sat at that heavy mahogany table and swallowed every insult, every passive-aggressive comment about my lack of children, every backhanded compliment about my career. I had watched my brother get served the best portions while I was handed the scraps both literally and metaphorically. I had kept the peace at the tremendous expense of my own sanity. I turned back to Trayvon. He was already standing packing his tablet into his leather briefcase. He did not ask if I wanted to skip the dinner. He knew me too well for that. Running away would only give Yvonne the satisfaction of calling me a coward. We were not going to run. We were going to walk straight into the ambush. Make sure the car is washed and has a full tank of gas by Sunday morning, I told him, grabbing my tailored suit jacket from the back of my chair. We are going to wear our best clothes. If they want an audience, let us give them a show. The drive back to our house was completely silent. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence that usually followed my encounters with my family, but a clean, sharp silence. The kind of silence that follows a massive storm. By the time we walked through our front door, the adrenaline that had fueled my fingers to transfer those funds had faded, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. It was 2 in the morning. Trayvon and I sat at the expansive marble island in our kitchen, bathed in the harsh blue glow of our laptop screens. 2 mugs of black coffee sat cooling between us, untouched. The house was entirely still, but my mind was moving at warp speed. Transferring the cash out of the joint family account was only the first strike. The real battle was dismantling the infrastructure of control my mother had meticulously built around my entire life. Trevin adjusted his glasses and scrolled through a dense scanned PDF of my company's original corporate paperwork. His jaw clenched tighter with every page he read. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the screen, the reflection of the legal text glowing on his lenses. I cannot believe she actually had the audacity to bury this clause in Section 4, Trevon said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet kitchen. He turned his laptop screen toward me, pointing to a paragraph dense with legal jargon. Do you see this, Kendra? She designated herself as a managing member with unilateral override authority on corporate distributions. She essentially gave herself a legal crowbar to break into your business accounts whenever she deemed it necessary. I stared at the glowing screen, a wave of profound nausea washing over me. I was 23 years old when I signed that charter. I had just landed my first major crisis management contract, working out of a cramped studio apartment that smelled like bleach and cheap takeout. I was terrified, overwhelmed, and desperate for validation. Yvonne had swooped in wearing her tailored church suits and projecting absolute authority. She convinced me that corporate clients would never trust a 23-year-old girl with their multi-million-dollar reputations. She told me I needed an older, established co-signer on the LLC to provide the illusion of stability. She framed it as a protective measure, a mother shielding her naive daughter from the ruthless corporate world. It was never about protection. It was always about leverage. She had weaponized my youth and my desperation for her approval to bind herself to my future success. I trusted her, I said softly, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. She told me it was standard procedure for family businesses. I did not even hire an outside attorney to review the documents because she insisted our church lawyer would handle it for free to save me money. I actually thanked her for it. I thanked her for putting a leash around my neck. Trayvon reached across the marble counter and placed his hand firmly over mine. You were young, and she exploited your trust. But you are not 23 anymore. You are a 35-year-old powerhouse who routinely handles corporate scandals for Fortune 500 companies. You navigate media disasters and hostile takeovers for a living. It is time to apply your crisis management skills to your own life. We are severing these legal ties right now. I nodded, pulling my keyboard closer. I cracked my knuckles and logged into the state business registry portal to initiate the restructuring process. The digital forms were tedious, requiring complex identity verification protocols and notarized declarations, but every keystroke felt like snapping a heavy iron chain. I was systematically revoking her status as a managing member. I filed the paperwork to change the registered agent. I formally dissolved the management access she held over my firm. As I navigated to the banking portals to update the corporate profiles, I could see the digital footprints of her entitlement. There were scheduled transfers I had never authorized, small increments of cash siphoned from the business accounts into the joint account I had just emptied. $500 here, $1,000 there, $2,000 right before Jamal's doomed food truck business collapsed. It was a slow, steady bleed disguised as accounting errors and miscellaneous operating expenses. She had been treating my crisis PR firm like a personal slush fund to cover my brother's extravagant failing lifestyle. I immediately revoked all secondary login credentials. I reset the master passwords using a randomized encrypted generator. I requested new corporate credit cards and explicitly flagged Yvonne's name as an unauthorized individual with our banking representatives. I set up two-factor authentication that routed directly and exclusively to my personal device. The administrative tasks took hours bleeding deep into the early morning, but the tedious nature of the work was incredibly grounding. I was building an impenetrable digital fortress. I was taking my life back one digital signature at a time. Traven watched my screen as the final confirmation window appeared. The state registry acknowledged the submission of the amended corporate charter. The banking portals confirmed the immediate suspension of all secondary access. The financial umbilical cord was officially and permanently cut. "What happens when she finds out?" I asked, leaning back in my chair and rubbing my tired eyes. The blue light of the monitor was starting to give me a headache, but I had never felt more awake. "She's going to check the accounts tomorrow morning. She always logs in on Mondays to see if any large client retainers have cleared." Trevin opened a fresh document and quickly typed out a formal cease and desist notice. He formatted it with the strict, uncompromising language of a corporate litigator. "When she logs in, she is going to see an access denied error. When she calls the bank, the manager is going to tell her she is no longer an authorized representative of your company. And when she tries to call you to scream about being locked out, she is going to get my voicemail. We are routing all family communication through me from now on. You are the client. I am the shield." I looked at my husband, feeling a profound surge of gratitude and love. He had watched my family walk all over me for years, silently honoring my request to keep the peace and bite my tongue. But the exact moment I gave the signal, he stepped onto the battlefield alongside me, without a second thought. The laser printer in the corner of the kitchen whirred to life, breaking the heavy silence of the early morning. Traven walked over and retrieved the freshly printed pages. They were the new articles of incorporation, clean, updated, and legally binding. He stacked the papers neatly, his eyes scanning the bold, decisive text that officially locked my mother out of the empire I had built with my own two hands. He set the papers down on the marble counter with a satisfying slap. "Let her try to open the vault now." It was 2 a.m. and the house was entirely silent. The only sounds were the low, steady hum of the central air conditioning and the rapid, rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. Traven and I sat side by side at our massive marble kitchen island, our faces bathed in the harsh blue glow of our laptop screens. A fresh pot of coffee sat untouched on the counter, growing cold as we worked. We were not just moving personal funds anymore. We were tearing down the entire financial infrastructure my mother had meticulously woven around my life for over a decade. Trayvon scrolled through a dense, scanned document containing my company's original corporate paperwork. His jaw clenched tighter with every page he read. He adjusted his glasses, leaning closer to the screen, as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. "I cannot believe she actually had the audacity to bury this clause in Section 4, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet kitchen. He turned his laptop screen toward me, tapping a paragraph dense with legal jargon. "Do you see the phrasing here, Kendra? She designated herself as a managing member with unilateral override authority on all corporate distributions. She essentially gave herself a legal crowbar to break into your business accounts whenever she deemed it necessary." I stared at the glowing screen, a wave of profound nausea washing over me. I was 23 years old when I signed that corporate charter. I had just landed my first major crisis management contract, working out of a cramped, poorly ventilated studio apartment in Brooklyn. I was terrified, overwhelmed, and desperate for validation. Yvonne had swooped in wearing her tailored church suits and projecting absolute authority. She sat at my wobbly dining table and convinced me that high-level corporate clients would never trust a 23-year-old girl with their multi-million-dollar reputations. She told me I needed an older established co-signer on the LLC to provide the illusion of stability and business acumen. She framed it as a protective measure, a loving mother shielding her naive daughter from the ruthless corporate world. It was never about protection. It was always about leverage. She had weaponized my youth and my desperate need for her approval to bind herself to my future success. I trusted her, I said softly, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. She told me it was standard procedure for family businesses. I did not even hire an outside attorney to review the documents because she insisted our church lawyer would handle it for free to save me startup capital. I actually thanked her for it. I thanked her for putting a leash around my neck. Trevon reached across the marble counter and placed his hand firmly over mine. You were young, and she exploited your trust. But you are not 23 anymore. You are a 35-year-old powerhouse who routinely handles corporate scandals for Fortune 500 companies. You navigate media disasters and hostile takeovers for a living. You built this firm from a folding table to a corner office in Manhattan. It is time to apply your professional crisis management skills to your own life. We are severing these legal ties right now. I nodded, pulling my keyboard closer. I cracked my knuckles and logged into the State Business Registry portal to initiate the restructuring process. The digital forms were tedious, requiring complex identity verification protocols and notarized declarations, but every keystroke felt like snapping a heavy iron chain. I was systematically revoking her status as a managing member. I drafted the legal addendums, filed the paperwork to change the registered agent, and formally dissolved the management access she held over my firm. As I navigated to the commercial banking portals to update the corporate profiles, I clicked through the transaction history. I could see the digital footprints of her entitlements scattered across the ledgers. There were scheduled transfers I had never explicitly authorized, small increments of cash siphoned from the business operating accounts into the joint account I had just emptied. $500 here, $1,000 there, $2,000 right before Jamal's doomed food truck business collapsed. It was a slow, steady bleed disguised as accounting errors and miscellaneous operating expenses. She had been treating my crisis PR firm like a personal slush fund to cover my brother's extravagant failing lifestyle while demanding I respect her authority. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hardened my resolve. The anger fueled my focus. I immediately revoked all secondary login credentials. I reset the master passwords using a randomized encrypted generator. I requested new corporate credit cards and explicitly flagged Yvonne's name as an unauthorized individual with our banking representatives. I set up two-factor authentication that routed directly and exclusively to my personal device. The administrative tasks took hours, bleeding deep into the early morning, but the tedious nature of the work was incredibly grounding. I was building an impenetrable digital fortress. I was taking my life back one digital signature at a time. Trevon watched my screen as the final confirmation window appeared. The state registry acknowledged the submission of the amended corporate charter with an expedited filing fee. The banking portals confirmed the immediate suspension of all secondary access. The financial umbilical cord was officially and permanently cut. Yvonne was entirely locked out of the empire I had built. I leaned back in my chair, rolling my shoulders to release the tension that had been building there for a decade. The blue light of the monitor was starting to strain my eyes, but I had never felt more awake. Trayvon opened a fresh document and quickly cross-referenced the new corporate bylaws to ensure there were no loopholes left behind. He navigated to the print menu and hit the command. The heavy laser printer in the corner of our home office whirred to life, breaking the heavy silence of the house. Trayvon walked over and retrieved the freshly printed pages. They were the new articles of incorporation, clean, updated, and legally binding, with only my name at the helm. He walked back to the kitchen island and dropped the stack of papers onto the marble counter with a satisfying slap. He looked down at the documents, then up at me, a sharp, uncompromising smile forming on his face. Let her try to open the vault now. The air inside the car instantly turned stagnant. I stared at the blinking notification on Trayvon's dashboard display, the red alert icon glowing fiercely against the sleek digital interface. $100,000. I repeated the number aloud, the sheer magnitude of the audacity briefly overriding my logic. It was not a desperate request for a handout. It was a direct, calculated financial assault. Trevon's fingers flew across his iPad screen, navigating through the back end of our advanced credit monitoring portal. He bypassed the summary pages and drilled straight into the raw data. It is a commercial lending application, he said, his voice clipped and strictly professional. A high-yield short-term bridge loan. The exact kind of predatory capital designed for failing businesses needing an immediate cash injection. They bypassed your personal credit profile and went straight for the firm's tax identification number. But they used your personal social security number as the primary individual guarantor. My mind raced, categorizing the incoming data with the same cold, detached efficiency I used when a client's stock price was plummeting amid a media scandal. How did she bypass the security questions? Trayvon asked, his eyes darting across the digital application log. You have two-factor authentication on everything. She did not go through the digital portals. I replied, the realization dropping over me like an anvil. She went old school, the fireproof lockbox. For my entire adult life, Yvonne had maintained a heavy combination locked safe in the back of her master bedroom closet. It was where she kept the family birth certificates, baptismal records, and original Social Security cards. When I moved out for college and later when I got married, I had asked for my original documents. Yvonne had flatly refused, citing her duty as a mother to keep our vital records secure from loss or theft. It had seemed like a bizarre, overprotective quirk at the time. Now, looking at the fraudulent loan application sitting in the queue, I realized it was a meticulously preserved cache of ammunition. She had my original government-issued documents. She had the physical proof of my identity. Trayvon reached for the dashboard console. I am locking it down right now, he said. I am initiating a hard freeze on all credit bureaus and calling the fraud department to terminate the application. We are bringing the police to her doorstep before she even finishes digesting that prime rib. I reached across the center console and wrapped my hand firmly around his wrist. No, I said, my voice eerily calm. Do not freeze it. Trayvon stopped, turning to look at me as if I had lost my mind. Kendra, this is a six-figure fraudulent loan. This is not a family argument anymore. This is a federal crime. If this goes through, your firm is liable for the debt. I know exactly what it is, I replied, releasing his wrist and leaning back against the leather seat. And that is exactly why we are not stopping it yet. You know my mother, Trayvon. You know how she operates. If we terminate the application right now, it remains an incomplete draft in the bank's system. She will spin it. She will cry to the police and claim it was a terrible misunderstanding. She will tell the authorities she was simply researching loan rates on my behalf to help the family and that she accidentally entered the wrong identification numbers. She will weaponize her age, her church standing, and her status as a mother to establish plausible deniability. She will walk away with a warning, and she will spend the rest of her life playing the victim of her cruel, ungrateful daughter. Trayvon's eyes narrowed as he followed my logic. You want to let her hang herself? I do not just want her to hang herself, I said, staring out the windshield at the passing traffic. I want to build the gallows, hand her the rope, and watch her kick away the chair. My crisis management instincts had completely taken over. Yvonne was no longer my mother. She was a hostile entity threatening my corporate infrastructure, and I was going to dismantle her with extreme prejudice. Pull over, I instructed. Call Marcus. Trayvon nodded, merging onto the shoulder of the highway and shifting the car into park. He pulled up his contacts and dialed Marcus Vance, our lead corporate litigator, who specialized in white-collar fraud and financial defense. Marcus was ruthless, brilliant, and deeply paranoid, which made him the best in the business. The call connected on the second ring. Trayvon put him on speakerphone. Marcus, we have a live situation, Trevon said. We are looking at a fraudulent commercial loan application for $100,000 filed under Kendra's social security number and the firm's tax ID. The perpetrator is a family member. We have not frozen the application yet. We need a containment and execution strategy. I heard the sound of a keyboard clacking furiously on the other end of the line. Marcus did not waste time with pleasantries or shock. He immediately shifted into tactical mode. Do you have the application reference number? Marcus asked. Trevon read off the alphanumeric code from his iPad. Got it, Marcus said. I am pulling up the lender's back-end registry now. Okay, I see it. The application is in a pending status. The perpetrator uploaded scanned copies of your physical social security card and birth certificate to bypass the initial identity verification protocols. However, because the loan amount crosses the six-figure threshold, the automated system requires a final digital signature to authorize the disbursement of funds. Can we trace the origin of the application? I asked. That is exactly what we are going to do, Marcus replied. If you freeze the credit now, the bank flags it as a standard identity theft attempt and closes the file. We do not want that. We want irrefutable, undeniable proof of origin. Wire fraud and identity theft require intent, Kendra. We need the digital fingerprints. We need the exact IP address of the device that clicks the final authorization link. How do we force her to click the link without the bank actually releasing the funds to her? Trevon asked, anticipating the obvious risk. I am conferencing in the executive fraud division at the lending bank right now, Marcus stated smoothly. I have a contact on their security team. We are going to place a shadow hold on the disbursement. The bank will simulate the final approval phase. They will send an email to the burner address your mother created for this application, prompting her to digitally sign the promissory note. The link will appear completely authentic, but the moment she clicks it, no money will move. Instead, the link will act as a digital snare. It will capture the IP address, the device signature, and the geolocation of the computer executing the fraud. It is a honeypot, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. We let her believe she has won. We let her believe she just secured $100,000 of your money. The moment she signs that digital contract, she commits federal wire fraud across state lines. It crosses from a family dispute into a matter for the FBI. Do it, I said without a single ounce of hesitation. Set the trap. We sat in the idling car on the side of the highway, the engine humming softly against the ambient noise of passing traffic. The air conditioning blew cold air against my face, but I felt incredibly warm. I pictured Yvonne sitting at her pristine dining room table, probably brushing off the dust from Jamal's tantrum, feeling entirely victorious. I pictured her logging into that burner email account completely oblivious to the fact that she was stepping into a highly sophisticated snare designed by the very daughter she had spent decades underestimating. 3 minutes passed in tense, unbroken silence. The digital clock on the dashboard changed to 4:15 in the afternoon. Then Marcus's voice crackled through the car speakers, sharp and triumphant. The shadow hold is active, Marcus announced. The bank has just dispatched the final authorization email to the perpetrator's inbox. The digital snare is fully operational. We are monitoring the network traffic now. The moment she opens that email and clicks the signature link, we will have her. The attorney confirms the trap is set. The bank is tracking the IP. The tense silence in the car was suddenly broken by the sharp metallic ping of an incoming notification on Marcus's end of the line. Trevon and I held our breath, the ambient hum of the highway traffic outside fading into the background. Through the car speakers, I heard the rapid clacking of Marcus's keyboard, followed by a long, heavy exhale. We have a direct hit, Marcus announced, his voice carrying the distinct thrill of a prosecutor who just secured a smoking gun. The shadow hold worked perfectly. The digital signature has just been executed on the promissory note. The bank's security system captured the complete metadata package. I leaned closer to the dashboard microphone. Talk to me, Marcus. What exactly are we looking at? We are looking at a textbook open and shut case of first-degree wire fraud and identity theft, Marcus replied smoothly. The IP address traces directly to a residential broadband network registered in Brooklyn, specifically your parents' zip code. The device fingerprint identifies the hardware as an Apple iPad Pro, which aligns perfectly with the device Yvonne uses for her church administration. She did not just open the email, Kendra. She manually typed your legal name into the digital signature field, clicked the box, acknowledging the terms of the $100,000 commercial line of credit, and submitted it back to the lender. Trevon gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning slightly lighter against the dark leather. She actually did it, he murmured, sounding both disgusted and entirely unsurprised. She committed a federal felony just to prove she still had control over you. I felt a strange, icy calm wash over me. The residual guilt of walking away from my family, the tiny lingering doubt that perhaps I was being too harsh, evaporated completely. Yvonne had not just crossed a boundary. She had attempted to detonate my corporate and personal financial security. She had proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that she viewed my identity not as her daughter, but as a resource to be harvested by any means necessary. Package those logs, Marcus, I instructed, my voice unwavering. Compile the IP, trace the device fingerprint and the fraudulent signature into a secured, encrypted file. Do not send it to the authorities just yet. Hold it in our private server. I want all the pieces on the board before we make our move. Consider it done, Marcus said. The bank will keep the application suspended in the shadow hold. To your mother, the portal will simply display a message stating the funds are processing and will be available within 2 business days. She thinks she has won. Thank you, Marcus, I said. We will be in touch shortly. Trevon ended the call and pulled the car back onto the highway, navigating the late afternoon traffic toward our home. Neither of us spoke for the remainder of the drive. We did not need to. We were operating in complete synchronicity. As soon as we walked through our front door, I bypassed the kitchen and went straight into my home office. I booted up my primary workstation, opening my crisis management interface. I was no longer dealing with a mother and a brother. I was managing a hostile threat. I had barely settled into my ergonomic chair when my personal cell phone buzzed violently against the glass desktop. I glanced at the screen. The caller identification flashed Jamal's name. I looked up at Trevon, who was standing in the doorway holding his iPad. He gave me a slow, definitive nod. I picked up my phone, swiped to answer, and immediately tapped the record button on my secondary desk monitor, capturing the audio through my studio microphone. Hello, Jamal, I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat, giving him absolutely nothing to work with. Well, if it is not the big shot, CEO, Jamal sneered. His voice was thick with unearned arrogance, dripping with the smug satisfaction of a man who firmly believed he had just outsmarted his opponent. There was a faint echo in the background of his call, the distinct cavernous acoustics of a large commercial showroom, punctuated by the soft murmur of salespeople and the squeak of polished shoes on tile. What do you want, Jamal? I asked, intentionally injecting a note of forced exhaustion into my voice. I just called to check on you, little sister, he mocked, his laughter sharp and grating. You left Sunday dinner in such a ridiculous hurry. You really thought you did something, did you not? You thought you could come into Mama's house, throw some pictures on the table, and humiliate me and my wife. You thought you could just lock your accounts and leave your own flesh and blood out in the cold to lose our house. I let a few seconds of silence pass, playing the part of the defeated sibling. I locked my business accounts for a reason, Jamal. I told you I am not paying your debts. Jamal let out a loud theatrical sigh, the sound of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. That is the thing about you, Kendra. You are so selfish. You forgot who raised you. You forgot who built you. But do not worry about it anymore. Mama took care of it. She handled the situation. I leaned forward, my eyes glued to the recording software, watching the audio waves peak and dip with every word he spoke. Handled what situation, Jamal? What are you talking about? I am talking about the fact that family always finds a way to survive with or without your permission, he declared proudly, serving me the exact confession I needed on a silver platter. You really thought Mama did not keep backups of your paperwork. You thought she did not have your social security card. and your birth certificate sitting right there in her lockbox. She did what needed to be done. We secured alternative funding using the family resources. The approval already went through. You stole my identity, I said, making sure my voice registered clearly on the recording. You and Mom committed fraud to take out a loan in my name. Do not use those ugly legal words with me. Jamal scoffed, completely oblivious to the gravity of his admission. It is not fraud when it is family, Kendra. It is a mandatory distribution of wealth. You owe us for everything we sacrificed for you. Think of it as an involuntary investment in your brother's future. The funds are clearing in 48 hours. You should be thanking me. I am teaching you a lesson about respect. While Jamal rambled on, practically writing his own federal indictment, Trayvon walked over to my desk and quietly slid his iPad into my line of sight. He had pulled up Jamal's public Instagram profile. The feed had just refreshed with a brand new post uploaded less than 3 minutes ago. I stared at the glowing screen, the sheer absurdity of the image, rendering me momentarily speechless. Jamal was not standing in front of a bank. He was not standing in front of a mortgage lender negotiating a way to save his home from foreclosure. He was standing in the center of a high-end luxury auto dealership. The photograph showed Jamal grinning from ear to ear, leaning casually against the sleek, polished hood of a brand-new custom black Porsche 911 Carrera. Brittany was standing next to him, wearing her new $12,000 Cartier bracelet, holding up a complimentary glass of dealership champagne. The lighting in the showroom gleamed off the pristine paint job of the sports car. I looked down at the caption Jamal had typed beneath the photograph. It read, "Blessings on the way. God is good. Upgrades only." They were not trying to save a house. The entire foreclosure story was a fabricated crisis designed to extort money from me. Jamal had convinced our mother to commit a federal felony, risking decades in a federal penitentiary, so he could buy a 6-figure German sports car to flex on social media. The profound level of narcissism and financial depravity was staggering. He was actively spending the fraudulent loan money in his mind before the bank had even lifted the shadow hold. "You hear that background noise?" Kendra, Jamal asked, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "That is the sound of my life getting an upgrade. Next time you try to cut me off, remember who holds the real power in this family. Have a blessed day." He disconnected the call. I reached out and stopped the recording on my desktop. The audio file processed and saved securely into my encrypted crisis folder. I had the bank logs tracing the digital signature to Yvonne's living room. I had the high-definition audio recording of Jamal explicitly admitting to the conspiracy and confirming the use of my stolen documents. And I had the time-stamped social media post proving the fraudulent funds were intended for the purchase of a luxury vehicle, completely destroying any potential defense they might mount about acting out of financial desperation. The board was set. They had handed me every single piece of evidence required to absolutely obliterate them. Trayvon took his iPad back, his expression tight with disbelief. "They are completely out of their minds," he said softly. "He is actually trying to buy a Porsche with a fraudulent commercial bridge loan." I turned back to my primary monitor. My hands were perfectly steady. I opened the secure portal that connected directly to Marcus's legal server and the specialized fraud division at the bank. I attached the audio recording. I attached the screenshot of the Instagram post. I compiled the final dossier of evidence. They wanted to play corporate warfare. I said, my voice cold and resolute. They wanted to steal my identity and buy a Porsche with my credit. I moved my mouse over the large red submit button on the interface. This button would simultaneously release the evidence packet to our legal team, trigger the bank to finalize the fraud protocol, and dispatch the federal authorities to both the dealership and my mother's brownstone. I clicked the button initiating the counterstrike. The progress bar on the screen filled with agonizing slowness, inching from 90% to a solid unbroken 100. A green confirmation banner flashed across my primary monitor. The encrypted evidence packet was officially in the hands of our legal team and the bank's federal fraud division. "It is done," Trayvon said, his voice quiet in the vast space of my home office. He set his tablet down on the glass desk, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding since we discovered the loan application. The bank has the digital signature. The trap is closed. Yvonne and Jamal are going to be facing a federal investigation by the end of the week. I kept my eyes locked on the glowing monitor. My hands remained hovering over the keyboard. That was just containment. I replied, my tone flat and strictly business. That was neutralizing the immediate threat against my firm and my personal credit. But we are not done. Trayvon frowned, walking around the desk to stand beside my chair. Kendra, you just handed the authorities irrefutable proof of wire fraud and identity theft. The bank is going to refer this to the FBI. What else is there to do? I turned my chair to face him. I looked at the man who had stood by me through years of my family's relentless disrespect. We addressed the root cause, I said. Why did Yvonne need $100,000? Jamal's initial crisis, the one that made Yvonne march into my kitchen and demand I empty my accounts, was only a $50,000 debt. They doubled the loan amount because Jamal convinced her he needed extra capital to save face. He wanted to pay off his gambling markers and have enough left over to buy a Porsche to maintain his wealthy facade on social media. Trevin nodded slowly, following my logic. So the original $50,000 debt is still active. Exactly, I said, turning back to my screen. And whoever holds that debt is currently threatening to take Jamal's house. I want to know who owns that paper. I opened a secure background check file I had compiled days ago when this entire nightmare first began. I had run a comprehensive financial sweep on Jamal to understand exactly how deep his liabilities went. I scrolled past his maxed-out credit cards, his defaulted auto loans, and his barren checking accounts until I found the specific commercial liens filed against his suburban property. There it is, I murmured, highlighting a block of text. The debt is not held by a traditional bank. Jamal was trading cryptocurrency on unregulated margin accounts and borrowing from underground sportsbooks. The original creditors sold his defaulted accounts to a third-tier, highly aggressive collection agency called Ironclad Financial Solutions. They specialize in high-risk asset recovery. They buy toxic debt for pennies on the dollar and terrorize the debtors into liquidating their assets. Trayvon leaned over my shoulder, reading the screen. They filed a preliminary intent to foreclose on his property last week. Jamal used his family home as collateral for his crypto margin account. I picked up my phone and unlocked the screen. What time is it in Chicago? It is a little past 5 in the afternoon, Trayvon said, glancing at his watch. Why? Because Silas never leaves the office before 8, I replied, dialing a number I knew by heart. Silas Thorne was the senior partner at a boutique wealth management and acquisitions firm I frequently used to quietly purchase commercial real estate and handle my private investments. Silas was a shark in a tailored suit. He possessed an uncanny ability to move massive amounts of capital through blind trusts and shell corporations without leaving a single trace of the original buyer. The line rang twice before a smooth, cultured voice answered. Kendra Wilson. To what do I owe the pleasure of a late afternoon call? Please tell me you have a new corporate acquisition for me to tear into. I need you to buy a debt portfolio, Silas, I said, skipping the pleasantries entirely. I need it done immediately, and I need it done behind a blind Delaware LLC. I heard the sound of a heavy leather chair squeaking as Silas presumably sat forward at his desk. I do not usually deal in retail debt collection, Kendra. That is bottom feeder work. This is highly specific, I explained. A firm called Ironclad Financial Solutions is holding approximately $50,000 in defaulted promissory notes and a collateralized property lien belonging to an individual named Jamal Preston. I want that specific paper. Silas paused. You want me to approach a predatory collection agency and offer to buy a single specific $50,000 debt? They are going to know the buyer has a personal motive. They will gouge you on the premium. They will demand 100 cents on the dollar, maybe more, just out of sheer leverage. I do not care if they demand 200 cents on the dollar, Silas. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. Offer to buy their entire regional portfolio of toxic debt if you have to. Bury Jamal's file in a bulk acquisition. Use whatever aggressive corporate tactics you deem necessary, But do not hang up the phone with them until my shell corporation is the sole legal owner of Jamal Preston's debt and the lien on his house. I could hear the sharp intake of breath from Trayvon standing beside me. The absolute ruthlessness of the strategy was settling into the room. Silas chuckled on the other end of the line, a low, appreciative sound. You never cease to amaze me, Kendra. Give me an hour. I will have my acquisitions team draft a bulk purchase offer Ironclad cannot refuse. Consider it done. The call disconnected. I placed the phone face down on the glass desk. Trayvon stared at me, his eyes wide. You are buying his debt. You are actually buying the rights to his financial ruin. If my mother wants to play games with my identity to protect her golden child, then I am taking control of the board, I stated. My eyes locked on the dark monitor screen. Jamal has spent his entire life protected by Yvonne's toxic umbrella. He has never faced a single authentic consequence for his actions. He thinks he can disrespect me, threaten me in my own home, and then use my stolen credit to buy a luxury car while his family faces eviction. I am going to teach him exactly how the real world operates. For the next 2 hours, the home office was completely silent. Trayvon went down to the kitchen and returned with fresh coffee and 2 plates of dinner we had neglected to eat. We ate at my desk, our eyes darting to my phone every time the screen lit up with a spam email or a calendar notification. The anticipation was a heavy electric current humming in the air. At exactly 7:45, my secure email client chimed. A message from Silas Thorne appeared at the top of my inbox. The subject line simply read, Vanguard Holdings, LLC, acquisition executed. I clicked open the email. Attached were dozens of scanned legal documents, transfer deeds, and digital receipts. Silas had executed a hostile buyout of a regional debt block from Ironclad Financial. Vanguard Holdings, a completely anonymous shell corporation, of which I was the sole managing director, was now the legal owner of over $2 million in defaulted regional debt. Buried in the center of that portfolio was the file I was looking for. I opened the specific PDF attachment containing Jamal's records. There they were. The original promissory note signed with Jamal's sloppy, frantic handwriting, the margin call notices, the aggressive collection demands, and most importantly, the collateral agreement binding his suburban home to the debt. The transfer was absolute. The power shift was complete and legally binding. I was no longer just the sister Jamal loved to mock and belittle. I was his primary creditor. I held the deed to his house in the palm of my hand. If he missed a single payment, a payment he was already 3 months late on, I had the unilateral authority to initiate foreclosure proceedings. I could evict him from his own home with a single phone call to the local sheriff's department. Trayvon read the documents over my shoulder, letting out a long, low whistle. You own him, Kendra. You literally own the roof over his head. I pulled up a secondary browser window and navigated back to Jamal's public Instagram profile. He had been updating his story throughout the evening. The first video showed him sitting in the driver's seat of the black Porsche, revving the engine, while Brittany laughed in the passenger seat. The second video was recorded inside a high-end steakhouse downtown. Jamal was holding up a massive tomahawk ribeye on a wooden board, a glass of expensive bourbon resting on the white tablecloth next to him. The caption written across the video in bold flashing text read, Celebrating the victory. Big money clearing tomorrow. God always provides a way for his favorites. I watched the video loop 3 times, the sound of his arrogant laughter echoing through my quiet office. The contrast between his fabricated reality and his impending destruction was almost poetic. He was sitting in a 5-star restaurant spending money he did not have, celebrating a fraudulent loan that was never going to clear. He was completely convinced that he had outsmarted his sister and secured his luxurious lifestyle. He had absolutely no idea that the bank's security division was currently preparing a federal felony referral for wire fraud. He had no idea that the IP logs tracing the crime directly to his mother's living room were locked in a digital vault. And most terrifyingly of all, as he toasted to his own brilliance, he had no idea that the anonymous corporation holding the deed to his house as collateral, The entity that possessed the legal authority to strip everything away from him before the end of the week was controlled entirely by the sister he had just told to know her place. The double doors of the Greater Faith Fellowship banquet hall swung open, releasing a wave of warm, heavily perfumed air and the sound of a live jazz quartet. Trayvon and I stepped over the threshold, our shoes sinking into the plush crimson carpeting. Yvonne and Calvin had not merely rented the fellowship hall for their 40th wedding anniversary. They had transformed it into a monument to their own vanity. The theme, boldly embossed in gold lettering on a massive welcome banner, was the Wilson Family Legacy. 4 decades of faith, family, and fortune. I stood near the entrance, taking a slow, calculating inventory of the room. My crisis management instincts immediately began tallying the cost of the spectacle. There were at least 50 circular tables draped in imported silk linens. Towering centerpieces of white orchids and imported lilies dominated every table, partially obscuring the faces of the guests. In the far corner, a ridiculous towering ice sculpture of 2 intertwined doves caught the light from the overhead crystal chandeliers. Waitstaff in crisp black tuxedos circulated through the crowd, balancing silver trays of premium hors d'oeuvres and sparkling cider. They were spending money with the reckless abandon of people who believed a $100,000 windfall was clearing into their accounts the very next morning. It was a masterclass in financial delusion. Trayvon rested a steady hand on the small of my back. He looked immaculate in a tailored midnight blue tuxedo that subtly complemented the structured emerald green evening gown I had chosen for the occasion. We were not dressed for a family celebration. We were dressed for an execution. We wore our success like armor, projecting a calm, untouchable authority that instantly drew the eyes of the room. "Look at the VIP section," Trayvon murmured, his breath warm against my ear, as he nodded toward a raised dais at the front of the hall. I followed his gaze. The head table was an exercise in pure, unfiltered ego. My father Calvin sat dead center, playing the role of the benevolent, prosperous patriarch. He was holding court with the mayor and 2 prominent city councilmen, laughing deeply at a joke while swirling a glass of sparkling water. To his right sat Jamal and Brittany. Jamal was wearing a flashy velvet dinner jacket, leaning back in his chair, with his legs crossed, projecting the unearned confidence of a man who firmly believed his debts were erased. Brittany was aggressively flashing her new Cartier bracelet at the wife of a church elder, her fake smile stretching from ear to ear. They looked like royalty. They had absolutely no idea that the woman standing by the coat check currently held the legal deed to their suburban castle. We moved slowly into the crowd, navigating the sea of church elders, local politicians, and high society socialites my mother had meticulously curated for her audience. Whispers followed us like a wake. I was the prodigal daughter, the black sheep, who had reportedly turned her back on her struggling family, yet here I was stepping into their grandest celebration. Elder Thomas, a stern man who had known our family for 30 years, stepped into our path. "Kendra," he said, his voice laced with manufactured concern, "I am surprised to see you here tonight. Your mother mentioned you were going through a difficult transition with your business. We have been praying for your financial stability." The sheer audacity of the lie almost made me laugh. Yvonne had completely flipped the narrative, painting me as a struggling failure who needed their prayers, masking her own federal wire fraud behind the guise of maternal pity. I offered Elder Thomas a smile that was perfectly polite and entirely devoid of warmth. "I appreciate the prayers, Elder Thomas," I replied smoothly, my tone projecting nothing but absolute success. "But my firm is having a record-breaking quarter. In fact, Trayvon and I are here tonight to celebrate new acquisitions. The Lord works in mysterious ways, especially when it comes to family finances." Elder Thomas blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by my complete lack of shame or distress. Before he could formulate a follow-up question, Trayvon smoothly guided me past him, steering us toward a high-top table near the center of the room. "She has been spreading rumors that your firm is going under to justify the loan," Trayvon said quietly, grabbing 2 glasses of water from a passing waiter. "She is setting the stage. When she suddenly pays off Jamal's debts and buys him a car, she is going to tell everyone it was a blessing from her own savings, and she will frame your lack of contribution as a tragic result of your failing business." It is textbook crisis PRI noted, observing the crowd. Control the narrative before the facts hit the press. She is insulating herself. But you cannot PR your way out of a federal indictment. Across the room, the double doors to the private bridal suite swung open, and my mother made her grand entrance. The jazz quartet immediately transitioned into a triumphant, swelling instrumental piece. Yvonne wore a floor-length gold-sequined gown that caught every ounce of light in the banquet hall. She looked radiant, powerful, and absolutely triumphant. She began to walk the room, greeting the politicians, kissing the cheeks of the church elders, and waving to the extended family members who had flown in for the occasion. She was in her element, feeding on the validation and the applause of her peers. She believed she had won. She believed she had outmaneuvered me, stolen my resources, and successfully maintained the illusion of the flawless, prosperous Wilson family. I watched her approach the raised dais. Calvin stood up, offering his hand to help her up the steps. Jamal clapped loudly, whistling for his mother. The display of unity was sickeningly sweet. They were a family bonded not by love but by complicity. Yvonne took her place at the center of the head table. A microphone stand had been positioned directly in front of her place setting. She adjusted her gold gown, smoothed her hair, and then her eyes began to scan the vast banquet hall. She was looking for her target. She had explicitly mandated my presence tonight. She had summoned me to this gala for one specific reason. She wanted to look down from her elevated platform and watch me swallow my pride while she celebrated the miracle money she had stolen from my identity. Her eyes swept over the back tables, past the ice sculpture, and finally locked onto the center of the room. She found me. I did not look away. I did not shrink back into the crowd. I stood perfectly straight, my chin held high, the emerald silk of my gown brushing against Traven's tuxedo. I met her gaze with a look of absolute, terrifying calm. Yvonne's smile widened. It was not a motherly smile. It was a predatory smirk, a triumphant baring of teeth. She believed I was standing there defeated, helplessly watching her bask in the glory of her fraudulent victory. She reached out with a manicured hand and grasped the silver microphone. Thump, thump, thump. She tapped the head of the microphone 3 times. The sharp, amplified sound echoed through the massive banquet hall, cutting cleanly through the jazz music and the low roar of conversation. The musicians abruptly stopped playing. The waitstaff paused in their tracks. Hundreds of guests turned their attention toward the head table, the room plunging into an expectant, heavy silence. Yvonne leaned into the microphone, her eyes never leaving my face. The amplified sound of Yvonne tapping the microphone echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the banquet hall, cutting cleanly through the smooth jazz and the low roar of conversation. The musicians abruptly stopped playing. The waitstaff froze in their tracks. Hundreds of guests turned their attention toward the head table, the room plunging into an expectant, heavy silence. "Welcome, family and friends, to 4 decades of God's unyielding favor," Yvonne announced, her voice booming over the speakers with practiced theatrical grace. "Before my husband and I share our testimonies of faith and financial breakthrough, I invite you all to partake in the harvest feast we have prepared. Eat, drink, and witness what the Lord does for those who walk in righteous obedience." The crowd erupted in applause. Yvonne's eyes flicked to me one last time, a silent command to fall in line before she handed the microphone back to the audio technician and descended the stairs to accept the embraces of her adoring congregation. Traven and I bypassed the line of people waiting to kiss my mother's ring and moved toward the sprawling buffet stationed along the far wall. The culinary display was another grotesque testament to their stolen wealth. Massive ice sculptures of the church's logo anchored a raw bar overflowing with fresh oysters and Alaskan king crab. Uniformed chefs manned carving stations with prime rib and herb-crusted lamb. They were literally feasting on the corporate identity I had bled to build. "They are burning through the bridge loan faster than I anticipated," Traven observed, quietly handing me a crystal glass of sparkling water. "This catering alone easily cleared 20,000. "Let them eat," I replied, taking a slow sip. "It is their last meal on my tab." Before Traven could respond, a shrill, artificially sweet voice sliced through the ambient noise. "Kendra, oh bless your heart, you actually came. I turned to see Brittany approaching, her arm linked intimately with First Lady Sarah, the senior pastor's wife. First Lady Sarah was the undisputed matriarch of the church's social hierarchy, a woman who wielded gossip like a holy sword and measured a family's spiritual worth entirely by their annual tithes. Brittany released Sarah's arm and moved in to give me a stiff, performative hug, making sure to position her wrist so the overhead chandelier caught the diamonds on her new Cartier bracelet. She smelled heavily of expensive, newly purchased perfume. "We were so worried you would not show your face," Brittany said, her voice pitched perfectly to ensure the surrounding church elders could hear every word. "Especially after Jamal told us about your little business troubles. It must be so difficult for you to be here, seeing how much God is blessing Jamal's ventures right now." First Lady Sarah offered me a smile that dripped with condescending pity. "We have been praying for your humility, Kendra," she purred, patting my arm with a heavy ring-covered hand. "Your mother has shed so many tears over your pride. She always said your obsession with that secular corporate world would leave you spiritually bankrupt. But look at your brother. He stayed close to the church, close to his family, and the Lord has opened the windows of heaven for him." I looked between the two women, the sheer hypocrisy of the moment crystallizing in front of me. This was the ecosystem that had created and sustained my family's narcissism. In this banquet hall, financial prosperity was viewed as irrefutable evidence of divine approval. It did not matter if Jamal was a serial failure who gambled away his rent money. It did not matter that Yvonne was a manipulative tyrant. As long as they showed up in designer clothes and threw large checks into the offering plate, the church community would provide them with an impenetrable shield of moral superiority. They fed Yvonne's ego and validated Jamal's delusions, creating a toxic feedback loop that made them feel completely untouchable. "Jamal's business is expanding so rapidly we can barely keep up," Brittany continued, aggressively stirring her iced tea with a silver spoon. She looked at First Lady Sarah, playing entirely to her audience. "Just this morning, the Lord blessed us with a massive capital injection. Jamal was finally able to purchase the executive vehicle he needs to meet with high-level investors. A brand new Porsche, cash." First Lady Sarah gasped in delight, clutching her pearl necklace. "Won't he do it? That is the fruit of righteous tithing, Brittany. Yvonne was just telling me how Jamal's business acumen is going to carry the Wilson legacy into the next generation. It is a testament to your mother's fervent prayers." "It truly is," Brittany agreed, turning her smug gaze back to me. "Family always survives, Kendra. Sometimes God has to humble the proud to elevate the faithful. Jamal is stepping up to lead this family financially, just like a real man should. Maybe if you apologize to your mother tonight, Jamal might be willing to hire you to do some administrative work for his new expansion. I know you need the income." Traven shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that signaled his readiness to intervene, but I placed a gentle hand on his forearm. I did not need rescuing. I did not need to raise my voice. The digital trap was already sprung, and the jaws were quietly closing around them. "You are absolutely right, Brittany," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant. "God certainly has a way of bringing the truth to the light. It is fascinating how quickly fortunes can change." Brittany's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing as she tried to detect a trace of sarcasm in my tone. She found nothing but serene confidence. She was expecting me to shrink, to argue, or to storm out in tears. My absolute calm unnerved her. "Well," Brittany sniffed, adjusting her designer handbag on her shoulder, "we are just glad you are here to witness the family's elevation. Excuse us, First Lady Sarah wants to see the new ice sculpture." They walked away, Brittany's heels clicking sharply against the hardwood dance floor. Trayvon watched them go, a low chuckle escaping his lips. "She has absolutely no idea that she is bragging to her primary creditor about a car bought with stolen money," Trayvon said, taking a sip of his water. "The level of cognitive dissonance is actually impressive." "They believe their own lies," I replied, my eyes scanning the room. "They have surrounded themselves with people who applaud their delusions. But the bank's federal fraud department does not care about First Lady Sarah's opinion on righteous tithing. The ambient jazz music slowly faded out, replaced by a low, rhythmic drum beat. The main lighting in the banquet hall dimmed, casting a dramatic spotlight on the center stage. The crowd murmured in anticipation, finding their seats and turning their attention to the front of the room. Pastor Miller, a charismatic man known for his booming voice and theatrical sermons, stepped up to the acrylic podium. He adjusted his microphone and looked out over the sea of faces, his smile wide and welcoming. Family Pastor Miller began, his voice reverberating through the speakers. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate a milestone of faith endurance and unparalleled prosperity. Calvin and Yvonne Wilson have been pillars of this community for 40 years. They have shown us what it means to build a legacy that withstands the test of time. The crowd applauded warmly. I saw Jamal leaning back in his chair at the head table, raising his glass in agreement. Tonight we honor their journey. Pastor Miller continued, raising his hands. We honor their commitment to family, and we honor the incredible blessings the Lord has poured over their household. Please put your hands together and welcome the matriarch of the Wilson family, a woman of unyielding faith and vision, Sister Yvonne Wilson, to deliver tonight's keynote address. 40 years, my mother breathed into the microphone, her voice vibrating with a practiced theatrical reverence. 40 years of standing on the solid rock of faith. When Calvin and I started this journey, we had nothing but a shared vision and a commitment to honor God by honoring family. We built a legacy from the ground up. We built it on sacrifice. A chorus of soft agreements and amens rippled through the front tables. Yvonne closed her eyes for a brief moment, playing the role of the humble matriarch overcome with gratitude. When she opened them again, her gaze locked back onto me, sharp and predatory. But the enemy does not want to see a faithful family thrive, she continued, her tone dropping into a somber warning register. The enemy attacks our homes. He attacks our finances. He tries to plant seeds of discord among our own flesh and blood. Recently, our family faced a season of intense spiritual warfare. My son Jamal, a man who has given so much of his heart to this church, found his business under attack. Jamal lowered his head with perfect comedic timing, staring at his empty dessert plate like a martyr bearing a heavy cross. Brittany placed a comforting, highly visible hand on his shoulder, ensuring her new Cartier bracelet caught the spotlight. We faced a mountain of debt, Yvonne said, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. We faced the threat of losing the very roof over my son and my beautiful grandchildren. And in that dark valley, we turned to the people who were supposed to support us. We turned to family, because family is supposed to be your safety net when the secular world tries to tear you down. The banquet hall was dead silent now. Every fork had been set down. The air was thick with the suffocating weight of public judgment. I could feel the eyes of the congregation shifting from the illuminated stage directly to the high-top table where I stood. But sometimes Yvonne's voice hardened the faux sorrow burning away to reveal the absolute spite beneath it. The world corrupts the people we love. Sometimes corporate success and secular wealth poison a soul. They forget who raised them. They forget the mother who carried them and the brother who protected them. They close their hands and their hearts. As the words echoed off the vaulted ceilings, my mind flashed back to exactly how my brother had protected me. I remembered being 19, working double shifts at a local diner to pay for my community college textbooks because my parents had drained my designated savings account to cover the damages when Jamal totaled his uninsured sports car. I remembered Yvonne sitting at the kitchen table telling me that family required sacrifice, and that I was being selfish for wanting to buy a laptop when my brother was facing a lawsuit. I remembered discovering a maxed-out department store credit card in my name 5 years ago, opened by my mother to buy Jamal a designer wardrobe for a job interview he never bothered to attend. Her definition of family loyalty had always been my financial subjugation. Yvonne leaned closer to the microphone, her knuckles white as she gripped the stand. She looked right through me, delivering the killing blow she had been preparing for weeks. We pray for those who turn their backs on their blood out of greed, and we thank God for stepping in to provide when selfish people won't. A loud collective gasp echoed from the tables around me. First Lady Sarah shook her head, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Elder Thomas crossed his arms, his mouth set in a hard line of righteous indignation. They were drinking the poison she was pouring, completely intoxicated by the drama of a wealthy daughter abandoning her faithful, struggling mother. "But God is good!" Yvonne suddenly shouted, her voice skyrocketing into a victorious crescendo. "He does not abandon his faithful servants. When earthly doors closed, the Lord opened a window in heaven. We did not panic, we prayed. And this very week, the Lord delivered a miracle harvest into our hands. $100,000 in unmerited favor. The congregation erupted. People jumped to their feet, clapping and shouting praises. Jamal stood up, raising both his hands in the air like a champion boxer entering the ring. Brittany was actually bouncing on her heels, cheering for the camera phone a bridesmaid was pointing at her. $100,000 to secure my son's business, to secure his home, and to propel the Wilson legacy into the next generation, Yvonne declared over the roaring applause. Let this be a testimony. You do not need to rely on the stingy hands of arrogant people. You only need to rely on the Lord. She lowered the microphone. The band immediately struck up a loud celebratory chord. The hall was a chaotic frenzy of cheering, hugging, and aggressive joy. I stood perfectly still amidst the noise. The sheer blinding arrogance of her speech was breathtaking. She had just stood on a stage in front of the mayor, the city council, and hundreds of witnesses and publicly taken credit for securing $100,000 to fund Jamal's lifestyle. She had officially, loudly, and proudly tied herself to the exact dollar amount of the fraudulent commercial loan she had taken out in my name. She had handed me the motive, the confession, and the public timeline, all wrapped in a bow of religious persecution. Traven leaned in close, his shoulder brushing mine. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked beneath his skin. "She is actually trying to humiliate you out of town," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She thinks you are going to run out the back door crying. Let them think what they want." I replied, my voice steady and cold as ice. She just gave me the final piece of the puzzle. I set my water glass down on the table. The sharp clink of the crystal went unnoticed in the roaring room. I smoothed the front of my emerald gown, checking my posture. I did not shrink. I did not look at the floor. I held my head high, projecting an aura of absolute dominance that caused the people cheering at the tables nearest to me to slowly lower their hands in confusion. I stepped away from the high-top table. I did not head for the exit. I did not walk toward the stage to argue with a narcissist holding a microphone. I turned my back on the head table entirely and began walking with deliberate, measured steps toward the back of the banquet hall. The crowd parted for me. People who had been glaring at me with judgment seconds ago instinctively stepped out of my way, unnerved by the terrifying calm radiating from my every movement. I walked past the massive ice sculpture. I walked past the raw bar. At the far rear of the hall, tucked behind a velvet partition, sat the church's audio-visual soundboard. A teenage technician in a slightly oversized suit was sitting behind the massive mixing console wearing headphones and bobbing his head to the jazz band. A sleek silver laptop was plugged into the center of the board, running the slideshow of family photos currently displaying on the two massive projector screens flanking the stage. I bypassed the velvet rope and stepped directly into the AV booth. The technician looked up, his eyes widening in alarm as I approached his station. "Ma'am, you cannot be back here," he stammered, pulling one side of his headphones off his ear. "This is restricted for church staff." I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my iPad Pro. I did not say a word to the teenager. I simply reached across the console, grabbed the main HDMI cable feeding the dual projectors, and unceremoniously yanked it out of the side of the church's laptop. The slideshow of Yvonne and Calvin on the massive screens instantly went black. Before the technician could even register what had happened, I firmly plugged the HDMI cable into the port on my iPad. I tapped the glass screen of my iPad. The synchronization was instantaneous. Behind Yvonne, the two massive projector screens that had previously displayed a slideshow of 40 years of perfectly curated, highly filtered family memories suddenly went pitch black. Yvonne was entirely oblivious. She leaned closer to the microphone, her eyes burning with malicious triumph as she prepared to deliver her final gloating remark. And so she began, her voice echoing through the silent, expectant hall. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can outsmart God's anointed. The Lord will always expose the wicked and elevate the righteous. Right on cue, the screens flared back to life. They cast a harsh, blinding, sterile white glow over the entire head table, completely ruining the warm, romantic lighting of the banquet hall. I swiped my finger across my tablet, bringing up the first file. The left screen populated with a massive, high-definition screenshot of the commercial loan application. I had used a bright crimson highlighting tool to circle the digital signature. Right next to it, the IP address trace logs populated, pointing directly to a map graphic that zeroed in on my parents' residential address in Brooklyn. I zoomed in on the device fingerprint. It read Apple iPad Pro in bold black lettering. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the front tables. Mayor Davies squinted, leaning forward and reaching into his breast pocket for his reading glasses. First Lady Sarah tilted her head, her smug smile faltering completely as the words "first-degree wire fraud evidence packet" flashed across the top of the massive display. I swiped to the next slide, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. The right screen was instantly filled with a chaotic collage of time-stamped digital receipts. There was Brittany's $12,000 Cartier purchase confirmation finalized less than 48 hours ago. Below it was the wire transfer authorization for the down payment on the custom black Porsche 911, Carrera explicitly linking the funds to the fraudulent commercial credit line. I superimposed Jamal's Instagram story video right in the center of the screen, looping endlessly on mute. He was holding up his massive tomahawk steak, laughing, silently toasting to his miracle money, while the financial proof of his felony surrounded him. The murmur of the crowd began to swell into a loud, frantic buzzing. Church elders were pointing up at the screens, exchanging horrified glances. The local politicians seated at the head table were physically pushing their chairs back, their political survival instincts kicking in. They instantly recognized the radioactive nature of federal fraud evidence and were desperately trying to distance themselves from the blast radius. Then I delivered the fatal blow. With a final precise tap on my screen, a newly split document overtook both projectors. It was the official legally binding notice of default and intent to foreclose. The document explicitly stated Jamal Preston's full legal name, his suburban home address, and his $50,000 defaulted crypto margin and underground gambling debt. I magnified the bottom section of the document, bringing the name of the new lien holder into sharp, undeniable focus. Vanguard Holdings, LLC. The noise in the room escalated into outright chaos. People were standing up at their tables. Gasps of shock echoed through the fellowship hall. Yvonne heard the sudden chaotic unrest. She realized the congregation was no longer looking at her. They were staring in absolute horror at the space just above her head. Her triumphant smile froze. She turned around slowly, the gold sequins of her extravagant gown catching the harsh glare of the projector light. She tilted her head back and stared up at the 50-foot-high digital display of her own federal crimes. I watched the exact moment her reality shattered. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and suddenly very old. Her jaw went completely slack. The carefully constructed armor of religious superiority melted away, leaving nothing but the raw, exposed terror of a woman caught dead to rights. Her fingers, which had been gripping the silver microphone stand with such absolute unyielding authority just seconds ago, simply gave out. The heavy metal microphone slipped from her trembling hand. It hit the hardwood stage floor with a deafening, violent crack. A high-pitched, agonizing screech of audio feedback ripped through the banquet hall sound system. It was a piercing, mechanical shriek that caused hundreds of guests to cover their ears and wince in physical pain. The live jazz band members scrambled backward, frantically trying to mute their amplifiers. The sharp, ear-splitting noise was the perfect chaotic soundtrack to the absolute destruction of the Wilson family facade. Through the pandemonium, I kept my eyes locked on the head table. Jamal had been staring at the screens, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. I watched the gears turning in his head. I watched him read the words "wire fraud." I watched his eyes track over his own defaulted gambling debts. Then I watched him process the name Vanguard Holdings, LLC. He looked down from the stage, his gaze sweeping frantically over the sea of panicked, whispering faces until he found me. I was standing calmly in the AV booth, my hands resting lightly on the soundboard, my posture perfectly relaxed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The miracle money was a trap. His house was gone. The sister he had mocked, the sister he had told to know her place, now held the deed to his entire life. There was no divine intervention. There was only me. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins bulged against the collar of his dress shirt. He kicked his chair back so violently it crashed into the towering floral arrangement behind him, sending white orchids and shattered glass scattering across the dais. He vaulted off the edge of the raised platform, ignoring the stairs entirely. His expensive velvet dinner jacket caught on the edge of the table, ripping the fabric, but he did not care. He hit the floor running. He shoved past two church elders, knocking a tuxedoed waiter backward into a tray of champagne flutes. The glass shattered against the crimson carpet as Jamal charged straight down the center aisle of the banquet hall. His hands were curled into tight fists, his eyes locked onto me with murderous intent. He was coming right for the AV booth, ready to tear me apart. Jamal closed the distance between the stage and the back of the banquet hall in seconds. He was a cornered animal acting on pure, reckless adrenaline. He shoved a heavy wooden chair out of his path, sending it clattering against the polished floor, his face contorted into an ugly mask of desperation and fury. He was screaming obscenities, his voice cracking as he demanded I turn the screens off. He raised his fist, fully intending to drag me out from behind the audio console by force. He never even made it to the velvet rope. Trayvon moved with a fluid, terrifying speed. He stepped out from the shadows of the AV booth and planted himself squarely in the center of the aisle, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He looked like an immovable monolith carved from solid granite. Jamal, blinded by his own rage, tried to barrel right through him. The impact sounded like a heavy sack of wet cement hitting a brick wall. Jamal bounced off Trayvon's chest and stumbled backward, his dress shoes slipping on the crimson carpet. He threw out his arms to catch his balance, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with sudden, sharp realization. Trayvon did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply leaned forward, his dark eyes locked onto Jamal's, projecting a quiet, lethal authority that instantly suffocated all the oxygen in the surrounding area. "Take one more step toward my wife," Trayvon said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that carried clearly in the dead silence of the hall. "Take exactly one more step, Jamal. I want you to give me a reason." Jamal froze. The artificial bravado he had worn like a costume all evening completely evaporated. He looked up at Trayvon, then glanced at the horrified faces of the church elders watching him from the nearby tables. The golden boy was trapped. Stripped of his mother's protection and exposed in front of his entire social circle, he simply shrank. He lowered his fist, taking a slow, defeated step backward, utterly humiliated. I did not wait for his apology. I walked out from behind the soundboard, brushing past Jamal, without granting him a single glance. He was completely irrelevant now. My eyes were fixed on the raised dais at the front of the room. The sea of guests parted for me. Nobody whispered. Nobody coughed. The absolute silence of the enormous banquet hall was broken only by the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels against the hardwood dance floor. I stepped onto the stage, the fabric of my emerald gown sweeping over the shattered glass and crushed orchids Jamal had left in his wake. I walked directly to the spot where Yvonne was standing perfectly still, her face drained of all color, her eyes wide with mounting terror. I reached down and picked up the heavy silver microphone from the floor. I wiped a smudge of dirt off the handle, tapped it once to ensure it was live, and turned to face the congregation. "You tried to steal $100,000 in my name to fund a lifestyle of absolute lies," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear across the vast room. I looked directly at Yvonne, forcing her to hold my gaze. "You used your own daughter's identity to bail out your son, but the bank did not approve your loan, Mom. They never did. They suspended the application the moment it was filed, and they forwarded the entire packet, along with the digital footprint leading right back to your living room, directly to their federal fraud division. Yvonne swayed on her feet. She opened her mouth desperately, trying to formulate a defense, a lie, a religious justification, but no sound came out. The brilliant, commanding matriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified criminal caught in the spotlight. I pivoted on my heels, turning my attention down to the center aisle where Jamal was still standing, flanked by Trevon's imposing shadow. "And you, Jamal," I said, my voice echoing off the walls. "You thought you could mock me. You thought you could use my credit to buy a luxury sports car while your family home sat on the auction block. But you failed to read the fine print on your own disaster. That $50,000 debt you owe, the toxic underground margin calls, the ones you put your house up as collateral for." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, ensuring every single person in the room hung on my next words. "I bought that debt," I stated coldly. "The anonymous LLC displayed on that massive screen behind me is entirely under my control. You do not owe an aggressive collection agency anymore, Jamal. You owe me. And considering you are currently 90 days past due, I am officially executing my right as your primary creditor. I am foreclosing on your house tomorrow morning." The entire banquet hall erupted into a collective gasp. The illusion was completely, irrevocably shattered. There was no divine intervention. There was no miraculous financial harvest. There was only a son who had gambled away his home and a mother who had committed a federal felony to cover it up. A sharp, piercing shriek cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Brittany marched out from behind the head table, her face twisted in a mixture of horror and profound fury. She ignored the broken glass and stormed directly to the edge of the stage, glaring down at Jamal. The shallow, materialistic facade she had worn all night was gone. She realized in a fraction of a second that the luxury car, the lavish dinners, and the suburban mansion were entirely gone. She was about to be homeless. "You lied to me," Brittany screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You told me the business was expanding. You told me we were upgrading. You used our house to cover your gambling debts." Jamal raised his hands, trying to placate her. "Brittany, wait, let me explain. I can fix this." "You have nothing," she spat back. Her face flushed red. She reached for her left hand and violently yanked her wedding rings off her finger. She threw them with all her might. The heavy diamond engagement ring struck Jamal squarely in the chest before bouncing off the carpet and rolling under a nearby table. "I am done. I am completely done with you and your insane family." Brittany turned on her heel and sprinted down the side aisle, pushing past the shocked waitstaff and shoving her way out through the double doors, leaving Jamal standing utterly alone in the wreckage of his own making. On the stage, Yvonne's survival instincts finally kicked in. She spun around and lunged toward Pastor Miller, grabbing the sleeves of his tailored suit. "Pastor, you have to help us," she cried, genuine tears finally streaming down her face. "This is a spiritual attack. Kendra is trying to destroy her own family out of spite. Please pray for her soul." Pastor Miller looked down at her hands, gripping his jacket. He looked at the 50-foot-high evidence of federal wire fraud displayed on the screen above them. Then he looked at First Lady Sarah, who was already stepping backward, physically distancing herself from the contamination. Pastor Miller gently but firmly pried Yvonne's fingers off his sleeves. He did not say a word. He simply turned his back to her and walked off the stage. One by one, the church elders followed suit. They stood up from their VIP tables, gathered their coats, and turned their backs on the woman who had demanded their adoration for 40 years. The social currency Yvonne had traded on her entire life was completely bankrupt. The congregation was abandoning her. I looked at my mother, standing completely isolated on the grand stage she had built to celebrate her own ego. The victory was absolute. I handed the silver microphone to a paralyzed sound technician standing near the edge of the dais. I descended the stairs, smoothing the fabric of my gown, and walked back down the center aisle. Trevon met me halfway, offering his arm. I took it, and we walked toward the exit together, perfectly synchronized, our heads held high. As we approached the heavy wooden double doors of the fellowship hall, brilliant flashes of light suddenly cut through the darkness outside. The harsh, rotating glare of red and blue washed through the massive stained glass windows, painting the frantic faces of the remaining guests in alternating colors. The piercing, unmistakable wail of police sirens began to rise in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. The authorities had arrived to collect on the bank's felony referral. Trayvon pushed the heavy oak doors of the fellowship hall wide open, just as 6 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives stormed up the front steps of the church. I stepped aside, the cool night air rushing over my skin as I watched the unmistakable, overwhelming force of federal law enforcement sweep past us and pour directly into the banquet hall. The officers did not hesitate. They bypassed the scattering, panicked guests and made a beeline straight for the center aisle, marching with a purposeful, terrifying authority toward the wreckage of the stage. Jamal was still standing near the shattered floral arrangements, his chest heaving, screaming at a paralyzed Calvin to do something, to call someone to fix the disaster I had just dropped on his head. Jamal Preston, the lead detective, called out, his voice cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the remaining congregation like a crack of thunder. Jamal's head snapped toward the advancing officers. The sheer arrogance that had defined his entire existence completely short-circuited. For a split second, he looked exactly like the terrified, irresponsible little boy he had always been. But instead of surrendering, his manufactured ego took over. He puffed out his chest, stepping forward and pointing an aggressive finger at the detectives. "You have no right to be here," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "This is a private family event. I am a respected business owner in this city. You need a warrant." "We have several," the detective replied smoothly, not breaking his stride. "You are under arrest for suspicion of first-degree wire fraud, bank fraud, and grand larceny. Keep your hands where I can see them." Jamal panicked. He tried to shove past the 2 leading officers, screaming that this was all a massive misunderstanding, a jealous setup by his sister. His resistance earned him a swift, brutal, and entirely public takedown. 2 officers grabbed his arms, twisting him around and driving him face first into the polished hardwood floor. The heavy metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed sharply through the room. Watching my golden child brother get pinned to the floor in his ripped velvet dinner jacket, stripped of his manufactured arrogance and reduced to a common criminal in front of his entire social circle, was the ultimate, irrefutable closure. Yvonne shrieked. She rushed forward, her sequined gown catching the harsh, rotating red and blue lights flashing through the stained glass windows. She dropped to her knees beside Jamal, pulling at the officers' uniforms, her carefully styled hair falling wildly around her face. "Unhand my son," Yvonne screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "Do you know who we are? We are anointed by God. We are the pillars of this church. Pastor Miller, tell them. Tell them to unhand him." The second detective stepped forward, completely unfazed by her theatrics. He pulled a small notepad from his trenchcoat pocket and looked down at her. "Are you Yvonne Wilson?" "Yes," she snapped, lifting her chin with a desperate, lingering shred of superiority. "I am the matriarch of this family." "Excellent," the detective said, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "Ma'am, you need to stand up. You are being detained for questioning regarding a fraudulent commercial credit application originating from your residential IP address. We will be escorting you down to the federal precinct for a formal statement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The remaining color drained entirely from Yvonne's face. The reality of the Miranda rights being read to her in the very room where she had just demanded the congregation's absolute adoration finally broke her. She did not scream. She did not argue. She simply went limp, hyperventilating as an officer gripped her arm and hauled her to her feet. Calvin stood a few feet away, entirely impotent, staring blankly at the floor as his wife and son were marched down the center aisle of the church like common thieves. The fallout from that night was swift, catastrophic, and deeply satisfying. By Monday morning, Jamal's unkempt, tear-streaked mugshot was circulating on every local news blog and community social media page in the city. The illusion of the wealthy, thriving entrepreneur evaporated overnight. He was sitting in a federal holding cell, completely unable to post his massive bail because his accounts had been frozen by the federal government pending the fraud investigation. Brittany did not even wait for his arraignment hearing. The moment the reality of her new situation registered, her shallow, materialistic nature kicked into overdrive. When she realized the luxury sports car was being repossessed by the dealership, and the massive suburban house was legally transitioning into my LLC's portfolio. Via foreclosure, she filed for an emergency divorce. True to her profound sense of delusion, she hired a vicious, high-priced family law attorney on credit demanding an aggressive settlement. She dragged Jamal through the family court system for weeks, screaming at the judge that she was entitled to half of the business assets, the jewelry, and maximum lifetime alimony for emotional distress. She was entirely blind to the fact that she was trying to squeeze blood from a turnip. The judge looked at her financial demands with absolute bewilderment. Jamal had no assets. His net worth was severely negative. His crypto wallet had been forcibly liquidated to cover a tiny fraction of his underground gambling margins, and his credit score was utterly annihilated. Brittany was awarded exactly 50% of nothing. She ended up having to move back into her sister's cramped one-bedroom apartment, drowning in the legal fees she had incurred, trying to sue a man who was relying on a public defender for his federal criminal trial. But the most devastating destruction was reserved for my mother. Yvonne had built her entire existence on the perception of flawless divine prosperity. She needed the applause, the respect, and the social hierarchy of the church to survive. Within 48 hours of the banquet hall raid, the church board held a closed-door emergency meeting. Pastor Miller, desperate to sever all ties before the federal fraud investigation tainted the ministry's reputation and donor base, issued a harsh public statement condemning financial deceit and moral corruption. Yvonne and Calvin were officially and permanently stripped of their church titles. There would be no more keynote speeches. There would be no more reserved seating at the high-top tables. They were completely excommunicated by the very people they had spent 4 decades trying to impress. Narcissistic communities turn on their own the moment the mask slips, and the church elders completely erased the Wilsons from their social circles. First Lady Sarah blocked Yvonne's number. The women who used to kiss her ring and praise her parenting now crossed the street when they saw her coming in the grocery store. The social ruin was compounded by total financial devastation. Federal criminal defense attorneys demand massive upfront cash retainers. With Jamal's assets entirely seized and their own savings drained from years of secretly funding his catastrophic failures, my parents hit a brutal financial brick wall. The reality of their choices finally cornered them, leaving them with only one agonizing option. I drove past their neighborhood 3 weeks later and saw the ultimate physical manifestation of their downfall. A bright red, freshly painted for sale sign was pounded deeply into the perfectly manicured front lawn of their beloved Brooklyn brownstone, the house Yvonne had prized above her own daughter's well-being. The pristine palace she had used to project her superiority over the rest of the family was being rapidly liquidated to keep her golden boy out of a federal penitentiary. They were forced to pack up their designer furniture, sell their luxury vehicles, and move into a cheap, nondescript rental unit on the far outskirts of the city, completely stripped of their wealth and their dignity. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I had simply held up a mirror and let them destroy themselves with their own reflections. A month after the banquet hall incident, I was sitting in the sunroom of my new home, enjoying the absolute unbroken quiet of a Sunday morning. The chaos of my former family was a distant, fading memory. I had sold Jamal's foreclosed property to a commercial developer for a massive profit, completely severing my final financial tie to the Wilson name. My phone buzzed on the glass coffee table, breaking the silence. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. I picked it up, taking a slow sip of my coffee before pressing the answer button. "Hello?" I said, my voice calm and perfectly relaxed. There was a heavy, ragged breath on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of muffled, desperate sobbing. "Kendra." It was Yvonne. Her voice was cracked, raw, and completely devoid of the booming theatrical authority she had wielded my entire life. She sounded small. She sounded utterly broken. "Kendra, please!" Yvonne wept, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic, humiliating rush. "Please do not hang up. I am begging you. They took the house. They took everything. Jamal is looking at 5 years in federal prison. You have the money now. You have the power to fix this. You can talk to the lawyers. You can drop the civil suits. Please, Kendra, you are my daughter. I am begging you for mercy." I kept the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the ragged, frantic sound of my mother gasping for air between her desperate pleas. She was crying, truly crying, perhaps for the first time in my entire life. These were not the calculated, theatrical tears she shed at the church podium to garner sympathy and tithes. These were the raw, ugly, suffocating sounds of a woman who had finally run out of other people to blame and other people to leverage. I pulled the phone away from my face and looked down at the illuminated screen. The automated voicemail transcription feature was actively converting her spoken panic into stark black text against a white background. They took everything. Jamal is looking at 5 years. I am begging you for mercy. I watched the words form, observing them with the detached clinical curiosity of a scientist studying a specimen behind a pane of reinforced glass. For 34 years, the sound of Yvonne Wilson's displeasure had been the governing force of my central nervous system. A single disappointed sigh from her used to be enough to send me into a spiral of anxiety, desperately calculating how I could fix whatever imaginary crisis she had fabricated, how much money I would need to drain from my own accounts to restore her good mood, how deeply I needed to apologize for simply existing outside of her control. I waited for that familiar crushing wave of guilt to wash over me. I waited for the biological imperative that dictated I must rescue my mother at the expense of my own survival to kick in. It never came. There was no tightness in my chest. There was no racing pulse. There was absolutely nothing but a profound, unshakable stillness. The invisible, suffocating tether that had kept me bound to her narcissistic orbit for over 3 decades had not just been cut, it had been entirely incinerated. I did not speak a single word into the receiver. I did not offer her a parting lecture, a moral lesson, or a final gloating goodbye. She was no longer entitled to my voice. I pressed the red button severing the connection in the middle of her weeping. I opened the contact settings, selected her unknown number, and tapped the block contact command. I watched the confirmation prompt pop up on the screen and accepted it without a fraction of a second of hesitation. The cycle of guilt was permanently broken. I set the phone face down on the polished glass coffee table and stood up. The sunroom was bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon. I slid open the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors and stepped out onto the expansive teak balcony. The crisp, salty breeze of the Pacific Ocean immediately rushed over me, tangling in my hair and filling my lungs with the scent of sea salt and coastal pine. The vacation home Trevon and I had purchased was a modern architectural masterpiece, cantilevered over a rugged private cliffside in Malibu. It boasted completely unobstructed panoramic views of the water, a zero-edge infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the ocean, and a level of secluded tranquility that money could only buy when it was absolutely legitimate. There were no mortgages attached to this property. There were no shady bridge loans, no forged signatures, no frantic midnight margin calls. I had paid for the entire estate in cash. The funds had come directly from the massive, untethered profits of the public relations firm I had built from the ground up with my own 2 hands. The same corporate secular firm my mother had publicly mocked and spiritually condemned. The same firm she claimed was poisoning my soul because I refused to funnel its dividends into Jamal's fraudulent lifestyle. My firm had just landed 3 international tech accounts in a single quarter, catapulting my net worth into a tax bracket my family could not even fathom. My hard work had yielded a fortress of peace. Their deceit, their arrogance, and their relentless greed had yielded a federal indictment and a cheap, cramped rental unit on the outskirts of the city. The universe had an incredibly precise way of balancing the scales when you finally stopped throwing your own weight onto the wrong side to protect your abusers. The sliding glass door glided open behind me, the smooth metal track making a soft, quiet sound. Trevon stepped out onto the balcony. He had changed out of his tailored business suit and was wearing a comfortable linen shirt and loose trousers, his feet bare against the warm teak wood. He moved with that steady, grounding, unshakable confidence that had been my anchor through the entire chaotic storm of the past month. He carried a heavy etched silver tray. Resting on it was a crystal decanter filled with 20-year-old premium-aged bourbon and two heavy-bottomed crystal glasses. He walked over to the sleek outdoor fire pit table and set the tray down. He did not ask who had been on the phone. He had seen the expression on my face through the glass doors, and he already knew. Trayvon understood the mechanics of my family better than anyone precisely because he was entirely immune to their manipulation. He had stood like a brick wall between me and Jamal's violent rage, and now he stood beside me in the quiet aftermath of the victory. He picked up the decanter, the amber liquid catching the fiery hues of the setting sun, and poured a generous measure into each glass. "It is officially silent out here," Trayvon noted, handing me one of the glasses. His fingers brushed against mine, warm and reassuring. "It is," I agreed, wrapping my hand around the cool crystal. "The silence is different now. It is not the silence of waiting for the next disaster. It is just peace." He leaned back against the glass railing, crossing his ankles, his dark eyes scanning the vast expanse of the ocean before settling on me. "I saw the headline on the financial blogs this morning. The commercial developer who bought the foreclosure from your LLC just broke ground on the new retail space. They completely bulldozed the property." I took a slow, measured sip of the bourbon. The smooth, complex heat bloomed in my chest perfectly, matching the warmth of the evening sun. I saw it too. Jamal's entire kingdom flattened into dirt to make way for a strip mall. It is fitting, really. He spent his entire life building castles out of sand and stolen credit. A strong wind was always going to level it eventually. I just happened to be the hurricane. Trevin chuckled, a rich, deep sound that carried over the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs below. "You were a Category 5 Kendra. You did not just level the castle. You salted the earth so they could never build on it again." "They left me no other choice," I said, looking down at the amber reflection in my glass. "For years I thought if I just worked harder, if I just gave them a little more, if I just proved my value, they would eventually love me the way they loved him. I thought I could buy my way into being respected as an equal, but a parasite does not respect the host, Trayvon. It just drains it until there is nothing left, and then it complains that the host died too soon." I looked up, meeting his unwavering gaze. They were never going to stop. Yvonne was perfectly willing to let me take the fall for federal wire fraud just so Jamal could keep driving a luxury car he did not earn. She would have watched me go to prison and then stood at the church podium the next Sunday asking the congregation to pray for my wayward soul. Trevin's jaw tightened at the thought, the protective instinct flaring in his eyes for a brief moment before settling back into a calm, steady resolve. She underestimated who she was dealing with. They all did. They looked at your kindness and calculated it as a weakness. They looked at your patience and mistook it for permission. He pushed off the railing and stepped closer to me, reaching out to gently trace the line of my jaw. "You are the strongest person I have ever known, Kendra. You navigated a minefield completely blindfolded for 30 years, and when you finally took the blindfold off, you did not just walk away. You bought the minefield, disarmed the explosives, and handed them the detonator." I smiled, leaning into his touch. "I could not have done it without you standing right there in the blast radius with me." "You never have to thank me for being exactly where I am supposed to be," Trayvon replied softly. "Family protects family." The word hung in the air between us, completely redefined. Family. It was no longer a weaponized term used to extract money and enforce submission. It was not a biological chain binding me to people who despise my independence. Family was the man standing in front of me pouring expensive bourbon on a cliffside overlooking the Pacific. Family was the team at my firm who fought tirelessly alongside me to build our empire. Family was the network of fiercely loyal, incredibly brilliant friends who had celebrated my victories without a single ounce of jealousy. I had lost nothing of value when I walked out of that banquet hall. I had shed dead weight. I had amputated a necrotic limb to save the rest of the body, and the phantom pain was already entirely gone. The sun began its final descent, sinking below the horizon line and igniting the sky in a spectacular, vibrant explosion of crushed violet, deep magenta, and brilliant gold. The coastal wind picked up rustling the leaves of the manicured palm trees framing the balcony. I turned fully towards the ocean, breathing in the vast, limitless horizon. There was no one left to manage. There was no one left to appease. My bank accounts were secure. My business was thriving globally. My peace of mind was absolutely untouchable. I had orchestrated the perfect surgical dismantling of a toxic dynasty, and I had emerged from the wreckage entirely unbothered, spectacularly wealthy, and fundamentally whole. I raised my crystal glass, holding it up against the brilliant backdrop of the fading sun. Trayvon stepped up beside me, raising his glass to meet mine. To boundaries, I said, my voice carrying the absolute unyielding certainty of a woman who completely owned her own destiny. To the family we choose, to the empires we build, and to the absolute beauty of untethered success. Trevin smiled, the kind of proud, deep smile reserved only for those who have weathered the storm and won the war. To the hurricane, he replied. The heavy crystal glasses met in the air, the sharp, clear chime ringing out like a final victorious bell over the sound of the crashing waves below. I took a long, satisfying sip of the bourbon, letting the rich heat settle deep in my bones as I looked out over the empire I had secured with my own brilliance. They told me I was a failure who didn't know the meaning of family. They were wrong. I just finally learned the meaning of my own worth. And unlike them, I never have to steal to afford it. The greatest lesson learned from this story is that your worth is never defined by the people who mistreat you, even if they are your own family. True security and happiness come from building your own independence and setting firm boundaries against toxic behavior. You do not have to accept abuse just because you share DNA. Sometimes walking away from those who constantly belittle you is the most powerful act of healing. You have the power to create a chosen family that respects your true value. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives? Share your story below.